Get out of first class right now. The command sliced through the quiet cabin with the kind of confidence that comes from believing no one would question it. And every nearby conversation stopped at once as dozens of eyes turned toward seat 2A, where a black woman in a simple charcoal sweater and dark blue jeans remained perfectly still, one hand resting on the armrest, the other holding a leather notebook that looked far older than the airplane itself. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply looked up at the flight attendant with calm eyes that somehow unsettled everyone more than anger ever could. The flight from Chicago to Los Angeles was scheduled to push back in less than 15 minutes, and the premium cabin had all the polished luxury people expected: warm lighting, chilled sparkling water waiting on polished trays, quiet conversations about business meetings and vacations, and the familiar confidence of passengers who believed they belonged exactly where they were sitting. Then everything changed. "Ma'am," the senior flight attendant said again, this time louder, "that seat isn't for you." A few passengers exchanged uncertain glances. A middle-aged businessman lowered his newspaper. A young woman wearing headphones quietly slipped one earbud out. Across the aisle, an elderly veteran folded his hands together, sensing the uncomfortable shift spreading through the cabin faster than turbulence. The woman in seat 2A finally spoke, her voice measured and almost gentle. "According to my boarding pass, it is." She held out the ticket without a trace of hesitation. The attendant barely looked at it before pushing it back toward her. There must be some mistake. Another crew member approached, glancing first at the woman's clothes instead of the boarding pass. "Economy is boarding through the rear door," he said with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. The woman simply nodded once. "I'm aware of where economy is." The silence that followed seemed to stretch longer than it really was. Something about her composure made the moment feel heavier, as though everyone in the cabin sensed they were witnessing more than a seating dispute. A young trainee flight attendant standing near the galley frowned at the scanner in her hand before looking back toward seat 2A. She seemed ready to say something, but the senior attendant gave her a quick warning glance that stopped the words before they left her mouth. Around the cabin, whispers quietly multiplied. "Did she sit in the wrong seat?" Someone murmured. "Maybe she has the wrong boarding pass," another guessed. Yet no one had actually seen the ticket except the crew. The woman remained composed, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, almost as if she had experienced this moment before. Outside the large oval windows, baggage carts rolled beneath the afternoon sun, while the jet bridge echoed with the footsteps of the last boarding passengers. Inside, however, time seemed frozen. The senior attendant folded her arms and spoke loud enough for nearby rows to hear. "If you don't move voluntarily, we'll have to involve the captain." Still, the woman didn't move. She simply closed her notebook, placed it neatly beside her, and looked directly at the attendant. There was no fear in her face, no embarrassment, only patience. It was the kind of patience earned over a lifetime of learning exactly how quickly people revealed themselves when they believed power belonged entirely to them. No one in that cabin, not the passengers, not the crew, not even the captain preparing for departure behind the cockpit door, had the slightest idea that within minutes, the very definition of authority on that airplane was about to change forever. Naomi Brooks did not glance around the cabin searching for allies because experience had taught her that truth rarely arrived with applause. It usually entered quietly, one person at a time. The senior flight attendant tapped her tablet again, her expression growing more certain even though the screen seemed to offer fewer answers than confidence. "Your reservation is not displaying correctly," she said, carefully choosing each word as nearby passengers continued listening. Naomi nodded politely. Technology sometimes needs a second look. The answer sounded almost ordinary, yet it carried the calm certainty of someone who had spent decades making decisions while entire boardrooms waited for her next sentence. The trainee standing near the galley looked down at her own handheld scanner once more. She frowned, then scanned the boarding pass from a respectful distance. A soft green confirmation flashed across her display before disappearing almost immediately as another notification replaced it. She blinked twice, clearly unsure whether she had imagined it. "Excuse me," she began quietly, but the senior attendant interrupted before she could finish. "I have this under control." The younger employee stepped back, although uncertainty remained written across her face. Across the aisle, the businessman who had lowered his newspaper finally spoke. If the ticket scanned correctly, perhaps there is another explanation. The suggestion was polite, not confrontational, but it shifted the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin. People who had remained silent moments earlier now started paying closer attention. A retired school principal seated near the window adjusted her glasses and observed the exchange with thoughtful eyes. A college student traveling home for summer break paused the movie playing on his tablet. No one seemed interested in entertainment anymore. They were watching people. They were watching character reveal itself in real time. Naomi rested her notebook neatly inside her carry-on without rushing. Every movement reflected quiet discipline. She checked the silver watch on her wrist, not because she was impatient, but because she valued punctuality. The flight was supposed to depart in 12 minutes, and delays affected hundreds of people beyond the cabin. "Ma'am," the senior attendant said again, "until this is resolved, I must ask you to step into the jet bridge." Naomi met her eyes with steady composure. "I prefer to remain in my assigned seat while the reservation is verified." There was no challenge in her voice, only confidence. That confidence seemed to frustrate the crew member more than resistance would have. People expected arguments. They understood raised voices. Calm certainty was harder to dismiss. Near the front galley, another flight attendant quietly whispered to the trainee, asking whether she had noticed anything unusual in the system. The trainee hesitated before answering. "I thought I saw an executive clearance code, but it disappeared." The words were barely audible, yet they lingered in the air. Executive clearance was not something assigned to ordinary reservations. The senior attendant either did not hear the comment or chose to ignore it entirely. Outside the aircraft, the ground crew disconnected the last baggage card while the captain completed final paperwork inside the cockpit. Everything appeared routine except for the growing silence inside first class. Even the passengers who had initially assumed this was a simple seating misunderstanding were beginning to sense that something else was unfolding, something much larger than one boarding pass. Naomi remained exactly where she was, composed enough that it almost seemed she was allowing events to unfold on their own timetable. She knew something no one else in that cabin yet understood. Sometimes the fastest way to discover how an organization truly operates is not during its best moments, but during the ordinary moments when people believe no one important is watching. The quiet uncertainty inside the cabin slowly transformed into careful observation as more passengers began paying attention to details they had ignored only moments earlier. The senior flight attendant tapped through several screens on her company tablet, her confident expression beginning to soften into frustration. Every few seconds, she glanced toward Naomi Brooks, expecting to find nervousness or impatience, yet neither appeared. Naomi remained seated with remarkable composure, her carry-on suitcase neatly positioned beneath the seat in front of her and her notebook resting on her lap. She looked less like someone trapped in an uncomfortable situation and more like someone studying how other people handled unexpected pressure. The trainee flight attendant finally gathered enough confidence to step closer. Keeping her voice respectful, she addressed the senior attendant rather than the passenger. "I scanned the boarding pass again. The confirmation showed green before another notice replaced it. I have never seen that happen before." The senior attendant answered without looking up. "The reservation database occasionally refreshes during boarding. Continue preparing the cabin." The explanation sounded reasonable, but it did not erase the doubts spreading among those who had heard the exchange. Across the aisle, the retired school principal leaned toward the businessman beside her and quietly remarked, "Experienced professionals usually verify before they conclude." He nodded in agreement while folding his newspaper completely shut. Near the window, the college student slipped his phone into his pocket without recording anything. Instead, he simply watched. Something about the woman in seat 2 Alpha suggested that the truth would arrive without anyone needing to capture it on video. At the front of the cabin, another member of the crew quietly approached with a printed passenger manifest. She compared several pages before whispering to the senior attendant. Whatever she said caused a brief pause. The senior attendant frowned, shook her head, and returned the manifest without another word. Naomi noticed every movement without appearing to stare. Years of leading complex organizations had taught her that uncertainty often revealed itself in small gestures long before anyone admitted it aloud. She had watched executives avoid eye contact before difficult votes, attorneys rearrange papers before delivering uncomfortable news, and investors suddenly become unusually quiet when facts began replacing assumptions. The atmosphere inside the aircraft now carried that same unmistakable feeling. The captain remained inside the cockpit completing pre-departure procedures, unaware that a simple boarding question had evolved into a test of communication, judgment, and professionalism. Outside the aircraft windows, the afternoon sun reflected across the polished wing while the last service vehicle pulled away from the gate. Boarding had officially ended, yet no one seemed eager to close the aircraft door until the uncertainty surrounding Seat 2 Alpha disappeared. The trainee glanced once more at her handheld scanner, hesitated for only a second, and quietly saved the system log before slipping the device back into her pocket. She did not know why she felt compelled to preserve the information, only that something about the disappearing confirmation code did not make sense. Naomi noticed the careful decision and allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile before returning her attention to the cabin ahead. She understood better than anyone else that integrity often revealed itself first in the newest employee, the one who still believed procedures existed to protect fairness instead of appearances. The senior flight attendant took a slow breath before making another attempt to regain complete control of the situation. She pressed a button on the interphone and quietly requested that the lead operations supervisor come to the aircraft before departure. Her tone remained professional, but the confidence she had displayed only minutes earlier had begun to crack beneath the weight of unanswered questions. Naomi Brooks watched the exchange without interrupting. She had learned long ago that people often revealed more through uncertainty than they ever did through certainty. Around the first-class cabin, conversations remained suspended. Even those who had originally assumed this would be resolved in seconds were now leaning slightly into the aisle, waiting for the next development. The businessman who had folded his newspaper checked his watch before looking toward the cockpit door. "This delay cannot be about one seat anymore," he quietly observed. No one disagreed. Moments later, the lead operations supervisor stepped onto the aircraft carrying a secure company tablet. He greeted the crew with a polite nod before reviewing the information displayed on the senior attendant's screen. His expression remained neutral at first, then his eyebrows narrowed. He opened another application, entered a longer authorization code, and waited while the system processed the request. Several seconds passed in complete silence. The trainee flight attendant noticed the supervisor glance twice toward Naomi before returning his attention to the tablet. It was a subtle reaction, but it was enough to deepen the mystery surrounding the passenger in Seat 2 Alpha. "There appears to be a reservation conflict," the supervisor finally said. "I would like to verify it through central operations before making any changes." The senior attendant folded her arms. "The cabin is ready for departure. We cannot continue delaying the flight." The supervisor answered calmly. "We also cannot remove a passenger until the reservation status is fully verified." His response shifted the atmosphere inside the cabin. What had begun as a routine disagreement was quietly becoming an issue of company procedure. Naomi remained composed, her hands resting lightly on her notebook. She did not volunteer information. She did not attempt to persuade anyone. Instead, she allowed the organization's own process to move forward exactly as it had been designed to do. The trainee quietly stepped closer to the supervisor and showed him the saved system log from her scanner. He examined it carefully before looking back at the main tablet. The disappearing executive authorization had been recorded with an exact timestamp. It had existed. It had not been imagined. The supervisor looked thoughtful but said nothing. Outside the aircraft, the gate agent received a phone call and immediately glanced toward the airplane with visible surprise. Inside the cabin, the public address chime sounded softly as the captain informed passengers that departure would be delayed for several additional minutes, while operations completed a final verification. Instead of frustration, an unusual calm settled across the cabin. The passengers sensed that they were no longer witnessing a simple boarding delay. They were watching a test of whether procedures would follow assumptions or evidence. Naomi quietly looked out the window toward the terminal building, where a black company vehicle had just arrived near the gate. She recognized it immediately, although no one else on the aircraft appeared to notice. Whatever questions remained unanswered inside the cabin would not remain unanswered much longer. The cabin door remained open several minutes longer than anyone expected, and the unusual delay slowly changed the mood from impatience to curiosity. The lead operations supervisor stood near the entrance with his secure tablet still in hand, speaking quietly into a company headset while reviewing information that appeared to update in real time. Each new screen seemed to replace certainty with additional questions. Naomi Brooks sat exactly as she had since boarding, composed and attentive, never attempting to influence the process unfolding around her. The retired school principal finally smiled faintly and said to the businessman across the aisle, "Interesting leaders usually do not announce themselves. They let the facts arrive first." He nodded thoughtfully before replying. "She has not tried to win a single argument, yet somehow the conversation keeps moving in her direction." A few rows behind them, the college student quietly closed his laptop. Instead of filming the scene, he opened the airline application on his phone and searched for information about executive travel procedures. He discovered that certain reservations carried internal security classifications invisible to ordinary booking systems, a detail that made him glance back toward Naomi with renewed curiosity. Near the galley, the trainee flight attendant continued reviewing the scanner log she had saved earlier. Every timestamp matched perfectly. The confirmation code had existed, disappeared, and then been replaced by a restricted access notice that her device could not fully display. She approached the operations supervisor again, this time with greater confidence. "I think the system is protecting information rather than losing it," she said quietly. The supervisor accepted the scanner, compared it against his own encrypted display, and paused longer than before. He thanked her without offering further explanation, but his expression revealed that her observation mattered. Across the aisle, another passenger, a retired airline mechanic who had spent more than 3 decades maintaining commercial aircraft, noticed the supervisor's reaction. "That is not how someone looks when they find a mistake," he remarked softly. "That is how someone looks when they realize they are missing part of the picture." His words lingered among the nearby passengers. Outside the windows, the black company vehicle Naomi had noticed earlier came to a stop beside the terminal. 2 professionally dressed employees stepped out carrying identification cases instead of luggage. They moved quickly toward the gate without drawing unnecessary attention, yet their purposeful pace suggested they had not arrived by coincidence. Inside the aircraft, the captain finally stepped out of the cockpit after receiving a message from operations. He greeted the supervisor with a calm handshake before quietly reviewing the secure tablet. His expression remained professional, but after only a few moments he looked toward Naomi with unmistakable curiosity rather than concern. No announcement was made. No conclusions were shared. Even so, the atmosphere inside first class changed again. The earlier assumption that one passenger needed to explain herself had quietly become a question of whether the organization itself fully understood who had boarded its aircraft. Naomi looked once more through the window toward the terminal, recognizing one of the approaching employees from years of executive meetings. She folded her notebook closed, rested both hands gently upon it, and waited with the same patience that had guided countless difficult decisions throughout her career, fully aware that the next few minutes would reveal far more about the airline than about herself. The atmosphere inside the aircraft settled into an almost unnatural stillness as the 2 executives who had entered the jet bridge stopped just outside the open cabin door. Neither carried luggage. Both wore discreet company identification badges that remained turned inward, as though they had no interest in drawing attention to themselves. The lead operations supervisor immediately walked toward them, lowering his voice until no passenger could hear the conversation. Even so, everyone in first class noticed the change in body language. The supervisor who had spoken with quiet confidence only moments earlier now listened far more than he spoke. The captain joined the discussion, accepted a secure mobile device from one of the executives, and carefully reviewed several pages before looking back toward Seat 2 Alpha. His expression no longer reflected uncertainty. Instead, it reflected the unmistakable realization that an ordinary boarding issue had become something far more significant. Naomi Brooks remained seated with the same calm posture she had maintained since entering the aircraft. She neither acknowledged the arriving executives nor attempted to influence the conversation taking place near the cabin entrance. She simply waited. Years of executive leadership had taught her that procedures revealed their true value only when everyone followed them without knowing who was watching. Across the aisle, the retired mechanic quietly leaned toward the businessman and whispered, "Notice something?" Nobody is asking her another question. They are asking each other. The businessman smiled slightly. That usually means the answer is already sitting in the room. Near the galley, the trainee flight attendant observed the exchange with growing curiosity. She had expected someone to quickly explain the reservation conflict. Yet every new person who examined the records seemed to become more careful with every word they spoke. She looked down once more at the save scanner log on her device. The restricted confirmation code still appeared exactly where she had captured it, complete with the original timestamp. She quietly locked the screen and slipped the device back into her pocket, sensing that preserving accurate information might soon become important. A gentle notification sounded from the captain's secure tablet. He opened the message, read it silently, and then looked toward the operations supervisor with a slow nod. Neither man appeared alarmed. Instead, both suddenly became deliberate, almost cautious, as though every decision from that moment forward carried consequences extending well beyond a single flight. The passengers noticed the shift immediately. The earlier tension that had filled the cabin was slowly giving way to anticipation. Whatever explanation everyone had expected no longer seemed sufficient. Outside the window, the airport ramp continued moving with perfect routine as baggage vehicles crossed beneath the afternoon sun and neighboring aircraft pushed back on schedule. Inside this cabin, however, time seemed suspended. Naomi glanced once toward the open doorway before returning her attention to the notebook resting quietly on her lap. She had not opened it once since boarding. She had not made a single telephone call. She had not introduced herself. Yet with every passing minute, the organization around her appeared to be discovering something that transformed confidence into caution. The truth had not yet been spoken aloud, but it was already beginning to reshape the room. Naomi Brooks lowered her eyes to the notebook resting quietly on her lap, but she was no longer seeing the leather cover or the polished cabin around her. For a brief moment her thoughts drifted backward nearly 25 years to a small regional airport where she had stood as a young operations analyst carrying nothing more than an overfilled briefcase and a notebook filled with ideas that no one had asked to read. She remembered watching aircraft depart while executives hurried past, without noticing the junior employee who stayed late every evening, because she believed airlines could become more than transportation companies. They could become places where trust traveled alongside every passenger. Back then she had promised herself that if she were ever fortunate enough to lead an organization, every policy would exist to protect fairness before convenience and professionalism before assumption. That promise had shaped every promotion she accepted, every difficult meeting she chaired, and every acquisition she approved. It had become the quiet standard by which she measured success. The memory faded as quickly as it had arrived, replaced once again by the calm light of the first-class cabin. Nothing around her had changed, yet everything felt different. The operations supervisor continued speaking softly with the executives near the aircraft door while the captain reviewed another secure message that had just appeared on his device. Their conversation remained private, but their expressions revealed that the answers they were uncovering carried more weight than they had expected. The trainee flight attendant noticed Naomi's calm demeanor and found herself wondering how someone could remain so composed while the entire boarding process revolved around a single unanswered question. Experience, she thought, often sounded quieter than confidence. Across the aisle, the retired school principal observed the same thing. She smiled gently before saying almost to herself, "The strongest people in difficult moments usually spend more time listening than explaining." Several nearby passengers quietly nodded. The cabin no longer felt divided between crew and traveler. Instead, everyone seemed united by the same curiosity. They wanted to understand why a routine reservation had drawn the attention of senior operations leaders before the aircraft had even left the gate. Outside the window, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the wing, bright enough to illuminate the polished metal with almost mirror-like clarity. Naomi glanced toward that reflection and took a slow, measured breath. She had learned that difficult moments were rarely defined by the first decision people made. They were defined by what happened after new information arrived. Character was revealed when certainty gave way to evidence. The captain finally looked up from his tablet and exchanged a brief glance with Naomi. It lasted only a second, yet something had unmistakably changed. The confidence of authority had become the caution of responsibility. No announcement followed. No dramatic statement interrupted the silence. Even so, every person in the cabin sensed that they were standing only moments away from discovering why one quiet passenger had allowed an entire organization to examine itself before she had spoken more than a handful of carefully chosen words. Naomi Brooks finally reached into the inside pocket of her travel bag, not with urgency, but with the quiet precision of someone who had already decided exactly when the next move should happen. She removed a slim company phone that looked almost identical to any ordinary smartphone except for a small silver emblem engraved beneath the camera. Without raising her voice or drawing attention to herself, she pressed a single contact that had remained pinned to the top of her screen for years. The call connected before the first full ring had ended. "Rachel," Naomi said calmly, "please activate Executive Verification Protocol 7. There was no surprise on the other end of the line. Rachel answered immediately with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this process countless times. "Understood. Verification is beginning now. Corporate operations, executive security, flight control, and internal compliance will receive simultaneous notification within 30 seconds. Please remain where you are." Naomi simply replied, "Thank you," before ending the call. She slipped the phone back into her bag as though nothing unusual had happened. Across the cabin, no one had heard enough of the conversation to understand its significance, yet the operations supervisor's secure tablet vibrated almost instantly. He glanced at the notification, opened it, and watched as a new authorization banner appeared across the screen. His posture changed immediately. The captain's device chimed only a moment later with an identical alert requiring executive acknowledgement before departure authorization could continue. The two senior executives standing near the aircraft entrance exchanged brief looks, but said nothing. Their silence carried more weight than any announcement could have. The trainee flight attendant noticed the synchronized notifications and quietly realized that this was no coincidence. She had never seen multiple departments contacted at exactly the same moment through the airline's secure network. The businessman across the aisle observed the same sequence and whispered to the retired school principal, "Someone outside this airplane just became involved." She answered softly, "Or perhaps someone inside this airplane always mattered more than we realized." Outside the aircraft, another company vehicle arrived beside the gate. Two additional employees carrying encrypted document cases entered the terminal at a brisk but orderly pace. No flashing lights appeared. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. Everything remained calm, deliberate, and remarkably professional. That professionalism itself began changing the atmosphere throughout the cabin. The earlier uncertainty slowly transformed into respectful anticipation. Whatever process had just begun clearly followed established company procedures rather than improvisation. Naomi looked once toward the captain, who was now carefully reviewing a growing list of executive notifications. She did not interrupt him. She did not volunteer an explanation. She understood that genuine leadership never depended upon announcing authority before facts had the opportunity to speak for themselves. Around the first-class cabin, conversations faded into complete silence once again. Every passenger sensed that they were approaching the moment when scattered pieces would finally connect. The questions that had delayed departure were no longer about a reservation or a boarding pass. They had quietly become questions about responsibility, judgment, and whether every level of the organization would respond with the integrity its own policies demanded. The secure tablet in the captain's hands emitted one final confirmation tone, softer than the others, yet somehow heavier than every notification that had arrived before it. He read the message once, then a second time, as though verifying that the words on the screen could not possibly mean what they clearly did. The lead operations supervisor leaned closer, silently reviewing the same encrypted authorization. Neither man spoke for several long seconds. The stillness spread through the cabin until even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Naomi Brooks remained seated, her posture unchanged, her attention resting calmly on the window before her. She had allowed every procedure to unfold exactly as the company had designed it, never requesting special treatment and never interrupting those responsible for making decisions. The senior flight attendant finally broke the silence. "Captain, is there still a reservation issue?" Her voice carried far less certainty than it had only minutes earlier. The captain lowered the tablet slowly before answering. "There is no reservation issue." The words settled across the first-class cabin like a sudden change in weather. Several passengers exchanged puzzled glances while the trainee flight attendant quietly exhaled, realizing that her instincts about the disappearing authorization code had been correct. The operations supervisor cleared his throat. The reservation was never incorrect. The system recognized a restricted executive travel profile that standard boarding devices could not fully display. The senior flight attendant looked from the supervisor to Naomi, searching for an explanation that still seemed impossible. "Then why did the confirmation disappear?" she asked. The supervisor answered carefully. "Because the reservation automatically transferred into executive security verification once it was challenged." His response only deepened the silence. Every passenger now understood that they had witnessed an internal process few people ever knew existed. Naomi slowly stood from seat 2 Alpha, smoothing the sleeve of her charcoal sweater before turning toward the captain. There was no triumph in her expression and no trace of resentment. Only quiet composure. She spoke with the same measured voice she had used since boarding. "Captain, I appreciate that you allowed your team to verify the information before reaching a final conclusion." He nodded respectfully. "Thank you for your patience, Ms. Brooks." Naomi offered a small smile. Patience is often the easiest part. Learning from moments like this is the harder responsibility. The senior flight attendant looked genuinely confused. "Who exactly are you?" she asked before realizing how personal the question sounded. Naomi paused for only a heartbeat before answering. "My name is Naomi Brooks." Another secure notification appeared on the captain's tablet. This time he turned the display toward the operations supervisor without saying a word. The supervisor's eyes widened as he read the executive profile in full for the first time. He looked back at Naomi with unmistakable respect. Around the cabin, every passenger sensed that the final piece of the puzzle had finally arrived. The mystery was no longer whether Naomi belonged in seat 2 Alpha. The only remaining question was how many people inside the airline were about to discover that the quiet passenger they had spent the last several minutes trying to identify had been quietly evaluating the organization from the moment she stepped through the aircraft door. The operations supervisor slowly turned the secure tablet toward the captain, allowing him to read the complete executive profile from top to bottom without interruption. The captain's eyes paused on the final authorization line before he carefully locked the screen and took a measured breath. Every movement inside the cabin had become deliberate. Nothing was rushed anymore. The senior flight attendant noticed the unmistakable shift in posture from both men and quietly lowered the tablet she had been holding. Confidence had given way to caution. The captain stepped toward Naomi Brooks with calm professionalism. "Ms. Brooks," he said respectfully, "I believe we owe you an apology for the delay and for the confusion surrounding your reservation." Naomi met his eyes with the same composed expression she had maintained since boarding. "Captain, I appreciate your willingness to verify the facts before reaching a final conclusion. That is exactly what good leadership requires." The operations supervisor spoke next. "Your executive verification has been fully confirmed through corporate operations. Every authorization has been validated." A quiet murmur spread through the first-class cabin. The businessman across the aisle leaned back slowly, finally understanding why the ordinary boarding process had transformed into something much larger. The retired school principal smiled gently and whispered, "Respect is always easier when the truth finally arrives." Near the galley, the trainee flight attendant watched the exchange with growing admiration. She realized that Naomi had never once relied on titles or influence to change the situation. She had trusted the organization's own procedures to reveal the truth. One of the executives who had arrived from the terminal stepped forward and addressed Naomi with unmistakable familiarity. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks. Corporate Operations is standing by, and the board has been informed that Executive Verification Protocol 7 has been successfully completed." Several passengers exchanged surprised glances. The title alone suggested a level of authority far beyond ordinary executive travel. Naomi acknowledged him with a simple nod. "Thank you. Please let everyone know that the flight should continue as scheduled once the crew completes its standard procedures." The executive smiled respectfully. "Yes, ma'am." The senior flight attendant looked from the executive to Naomi, clearly trying to understand the full picture. "Ms. Brooks," she asked carefully, "may I ask why your reservation carried so many security restrictions?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Because I occasionally travel without advance notice. It allows me to experience the company exactly as every passenger experiences it." The words settled over the cabin with quiet significance. The passengers now understood that this had never been about luxury seating or special privileges. It had been about observing the organization through ordinary moments. The captain looked toward the operations supervisor, who quietly nodded before speaking clearly enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "For the record, Ms. Naomi Brooks serves as chair of the board for Apex Air Holdings, the parent company responsible for this airline." Complete silence filled the cabin. Even those who had suspected an important executive had not imagined someone with ultimate oversight of the organization. Naomi remained perfectly composed, offering no dramatic reaction to the announcement. She simply picked up her notebook once again and waited for the flight to continue, knowing that true authority never needed to be performed. It only needed to be exercised with integrity when the moment required it. The announcement settled over the cabin with remarkable quiet. No one reacted immediately because the words themselves seemed almost too unexpected to process. The passengers who had spent the last several minutes observing an unusual boarding delay now found themselves looking at Naomi Brooks with entirely different eyes, yet she did not appear any different than when she had first taken her seat. She remained dressed simply, her notebook resting on her lap, her expression calm, as though titles and authority had never been the point. The captain straightened his uniform jacket before addressing the cabin once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will complete our final departure preparations shortly." His voice remained steady, but those closest to the front of the aircraft could hear a new measure of respect in every word directed toward Naomi. The senior flight attendant took a slow breath before stepping forward. "Ms. Brooks," she said quietly, "I regret the assumptions that contributed to today's delay. I should have slowed down and verified every detail before reaching a conclusion." Naomi looked at her with the same composed expression she had shown from the beginning. "Every professional makes mistakes," she replied. "The important question is whether we treat them as something to hide or something to learn from." The simple response seemed to ease some of the tension that had settled over the cabin. Near the galley, the trainee flight attendant listened carefully, recognizing that this conversation had become a lesson far larger than airline procedures. The operations supervisor nodded in agreement. "Corporate compliance has already requested a complete review of today's boarding sequence," he explained. "Not to assign blame before the facts are understood, but to identify where communication and verification can be strengthened." Naomi acknowledged the decision with a slight nod. That is exactly how lasting improvement begins. Across the aisle, the retired school principal smiled warmly. "Good organizations do not become stronger by pretending nothing happened," she observed. "They become stronger by refusing to waste difficult moments." Several nearby passengers quietly agreed. Even the businessman who had remained mostly silent throughout the delay finally spoke. Most people would have introduced themselves immediately. Naomi smiled gently. "If I had done that, we would only have learned how people respond to titles. I wanted to see how our processes responded to uncertainty." Those words lingered throughout the first-class cabin. The executives standing near the aircraft entrance exchanged thoughtful glances because they understood exactly what she meant. Systems designed to protect fairness had to function consistently regardless of who occupied the seat. The captain received one final confirmation from operations that departure clearance had been restored. Before returning to the cockpit, he looked toward Naomi once more. "Thank you for reminding all of us that leadership begins with careful judgment." Naomi closed her notebook and looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers and crew alike. "Organizations earn trust one decision at a time," she said softly. "The most important decisions are often the ordinary ones, Because those are the moments that reveal who we truly are when we believe no one important is watching. The aircraft door finally closed, and as the cabin prepared for departure, the atmosphere felt noticeably different from the one that had existed only a short time earlier. Nothing about the airplane itself had changed, yet nearly everyone on board had gained a deeper understanding of professionalism, accountability, and the quiet strength of allowing truth to speak before authority ever needed to. The aircraft began its slow pushback from the gate as the last ground crew members stepped away and the terminal gradually disappeared beyond the cabin windows. Inside first class, the earlier tension had settled into thoughtful silence. No one seemed interested in returning immediately to unfinished emails or in-flight entertainment because the ordinary routine of travel had been replaced by something far more memorable. Naomi Brooks opened her notebook for the first time since boarding. The pages were not filled with financial projections or acquisition plans. Instead, they contained handwritten observations about customer experience, communication, and decision-making. Short notes occupied the margins beside carefully dated entries from previous flights. She added only one new sentence before closing the notebook again. The operations supervisor noticed the movement and asked quietly, "Would you be willing to share your observations with our executive leadership after we land?" Naomi smiled politely. That was always the purpose of this trip. He nodded with genuine appreciation. Then today's events will become part of a much larger conversation. Several rows away, the trainee flight attendant continued serving refreshments, but her confidence had noticeably grown. She had trusted the evidence when uncertainty surrounded her, and that small decision now carried unexpected meaning. As she reached Naomi's seat, she offered a warm smile. "Thank you for reminding me that careful verification matters." Naomi accepted a glass of water before replying. Never let experience replace curiosity. The moment we stop asking careful questions, we stop learning. The young employee thanked her and quietly continued down the aisle, carrying that advice with her more carefully than the service tray itself. Near the front of the cabin, the captain made one final visit before returning permanently to the flight deck. "Corporate compliance has already scheduled a complete operational review," he explained. "Training materials will be updated, boarding verification procedures will be examined, and executive leadership requested that the saved system logs remain preserved for educational purposes." Naomi nodded with approval. Then today was not wasted. The businessman across the aisle listened thoughtfully before saying, "Most companies wait for headlines before they improve." Naomi answered without hesitation. "The best organizations improve long before headlines become necessary." The retired school principal smiled in quiet agreement. That is probably why they continue earning people's trust. Outside the windows, the aircraft climbed steadily above the clouds, leaving the airport far below. The sunlight spread across the wings in long bands of gold, illuminating the cabin with a calm brightness that felt entirely different from the uncertainty that had filled it before departure. The executives who had boarded briefly before takeoff had already returned to their seats in the rear of the aircraft after sending detailed reports to headquarters. There had been no dramatic announcements, no public spectacle, and no immediate disciplinary decisions made in front of passengers. Instead, every action followed established procedures, documented facts, and careful review. Naomi preferred it that way. Leadership, she believed, was measured not by dramatic moments, but by consistent standards applied with fairness and integrity. As the aircraft settled into cruising altitude, the cabin finally returned to the quiet rhythm of an ordinary flight. Yet everyone who had witnessed the morning's events understood that they had experienced something uncommon. They had watched an organization confront an unexpected challenge, rely on its own processes, acknowledge mistakes without defensiveness, and choose improvement over appearances. For Naomi Brooks, that outcome mattered far more than anyone recognizing her title, because reputations could open doors, but character was what determined what happened after those doors were opened. Several hours later, as the aircraft descended through the clear afternoon sky toward Los Angeles, the mood inside the cabin felt remarkably different from the one that had existed before departure. Conversations had returned, laptops had reopened, and coffee cups had long since been emptied. Yet the memory of the morning remained present in quiet ways. The passengers had witnessed something that could not be measured by miles traveled or schedules kept. They had watched an organization confront uncertainty, rely on evidence instead of assumption, and choose reflection over defensiveness. Naomi Brooks looked through the window as the coastline slowly came into view, sunlight stretching across the Pacific in long ribbons of gold. She had completed the notes in her notebook long before the captain announced the initial descent. They were not criticisms written in frustration. They were recommendations written with optimism, each one focused on improving communication, strengthening verification procedures, and helping employees make thoughtful decisions under pressure. When the aircraft reached the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers remained unusually patient instead of rushing into the aisle. The retired school principal approached Naomi first. "Thank you," she said warmly. "Not because of your position, but because you showed everyone that dignity and professionalism can exist in the same conversation." Naomi smiled. "Thank you for noticing the difference." The businessman followed, extending his hand. "Today reminded me that titles may earn attention, but character earns trust." Naomi shook his hand and replied, "Character is the only thing that keeps trust alive after the introductions are over." The trainee flight attendant waited until nearly every passenger had left before quietly approaching. "I do not think I will ever forget today," she admitted. "Neither will I," Naomi answered. "Not because of what happened, but because of what can happen next. Learn from every difficult day. That is how careers become meaningful." The young employee nodded, visibly determined to carry those words into every future flight. Near the aircraft door, the captain thanked Naomi once more before she stepped onto the jet bridge. The executives who had met the flight earlier were already waiting nearby with updated reports from corporate compliance and operations. Naomi accepted the folder but did not open it immediately. She already knew the most important lesson had not been written on any page. It had unfolded naturally through ordinary people making ordinary decisions under unexpected circumstances. As she walked through the terminal, travelers passed without recognizing her, and she preferred it that way. Leadership, she believed, was never about being recognized everywhere. It was about building systems that treated every person with fairness whether anyone recognized them or not. She paused briefly before the terminal exit, looked back once toward the aircraft that had carried everyone safely across the country, and quietly reflected on the journey. The airplane had not changed. The destination had not changed. The people aboard had. And perhaps that was the greatest measure of success any leader could hope for. Real authority is never proven by announcing who you are. It is revealed by the standards you choose to protect, the fairness you practice when no one is watching, and the integrity you leave behind long after the flight has ended.